Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into a really significant historical document. Our source material is the major academic work, All That Remains, the Palestinian villages occupied and depopulated by Israel in 1948. It's edited by Walid Khalidi, published by the Institute for Palestine Studies.
And our mission here, well, it's more than just listing names. We're really trying to navigate this incredibly detailed record. It's meticulously compiled. It covers the Palestinian villages that underwent huge changes, physically and demographically, during and right after the 1948 war, the conflict that led to the founding of the State of Israel.
Right.
This book essentially tries to reconstruct, on paper, a geography that was largely wiped off the map on the ground.
And the sheer scale of what they documented is probably the first thing to grasp. The headline finding, really, across all these pages is the identification of 418 villages.
Exactly, 418.
And that number, it's incredibly important because the research shows these 418 villages were home to over half of all the Palestinian refugees created during that time.
It's a staggering figure. It really measures this huge demographic shift, this physical transformation, mapped out village by village. For you, listening, getting a handle on this documentation is, well, it's a vital way to grasp the scale of what happened. It takes the conversation away from just abstract numbers and grounds it in concrete places, in geography. It gives you detailed evidence, the physical layout, the population, how the land was owned for each place before it was depopulated.
So it's almost like a kind of counter-archive, isn't it? An archaeological and cultural one. A method to keep the detailed physical reality alive when, political and military events tried to erase it.
That captures the intent perfectly. So let's start with that stark physical reality. The source material goes into detail about how by the end of the 48 war and in the years just after, hundreds of these villages were destroyed.
And we're not just talking about damage from fighting, are we?
No, not at all. The sources are very explicit. Many were deliberately blown up or systematically bulldozed, which often made it incredibly hard, even decades later, for researchers to even access or identify the sites.
Yeah, when you say bulldozed, I think some people might picture, a quick clearing. But the way it's documented, it sounds much more thorough, like an attempt to erase the actual footprint of the community. So what did the field teams actually find on the ground when they visited these 418 sites, mostly in the 80s and 90s?
Well, the physical evidence they found is quite telling, often by its absence. The backdrop here, as the book's preface notes, is the creation of about 750,000 refugees, people forced out or fleeing.
Okay.
So when the field researchers went out armed with their maps, what they usually found were just minimal traces, maybe clustered piles of stones, faint outlines of where house walls had fallen, perhaps fragments of old orchards, forgotten, or just the collapsed ruins of a mosque or church.
Wow.
In, I'd say, the vast majority of cases, the whole village site was just scattered rubble. Or worse, simply turned into farmland.
So the aim wasn't just moving the people out, but actually displacing the buildings themselves. It really sounds like in many places the idea was to leave almost no physical trace. So someone just passing by would see a landscape, not a history.
Exactly.
And this connects directly to the book's dedication, which is quite moving, to all those for whom these villages were home and to their descendants. It feels like an act of memory preservation, pushing back against that physical erasure.
It absolutely connects to that idea of memoria, of collective memory. The book is designed as this meticulous historical record. Its purpose is to rescue the very existence of these vanished villages from being completely forgotten. It tries to give life back to a name on a map, provide the physical context, the architecture behind a statistic, and crucially, to affirm the cultural history of these places for the descendants.
So the title, All That Remains. If we look at the photos taken during the fieldwork, mostly in the 80s and 90s, what does that actually look like? You mentioned contrasting scenes.
Yes, the photos are quite revealing. They show different levels of destruction, really depending on the local geography and what the houses were built from. For instance, you look at places like Kirbat al-Buwaida, that's in the Al-Ramla district, or Al-Qisas near Gaza. There, the village sites show clear piles of stone rubble, fragments of walls, sort of a classic ruin field.
Yeah.
And the same for Al-Zug al-Fawqani in Safad. You can see houses reduced to crumbled concrete blocks.
But then there are the sites where there's just nothing left. That's striking to me. Places so completely level, they just blend into the modern farms.
Exactly. That happened too. Sites like Al-Atrafiyah in the Beisan district and Kudna down in Hebron, they basically vanished under pasture land or modern large-scale farming. Especially in the lowland valleys, villages were often built with mud brick.
Ah, okay.
So they were particularly easy to just plow under to become part of the soil again. It's incredibly difficult, sometimes actually impossible, for researchers to even find the original boundaries in those leveled areas.
And what about the places where modern life has just sort of overlaid the village site? The book mentions locations that have been completely repurposed. That seems like a different kind of historical layering.
That's a really important point. Modern land use has sometimes taken over the village site for totally different things, nothing residential. We see the example of Altantura, a coastal village in the Haifa district. It's now, believe it or not, a theme park.
A theme park.
Yes. And maybe even more telling, the cemetery of Salama, which was in Jaffa, has been turned into a public park. So in these cases, the history isn't just buried under rubble, it's actively masked by recreation, by leisure activities. It fundamentally changes the feeling, the historical weight of that piece of land.
That contrast between rubble and recreation just highlights how essential this documentary evidence really is. Which brings us neatly to the methodology, because what's fascinating here is the incredible scholarly effort involved. This wasn't some quick survey.
No, absolutely not. It was a huge undertaking. It involved the Institute for Palestine Studies, Birdsight University on the West Bank, and also the Galilee Center for Social Research. They had to pull together multiple sources that sometimes conflicted, even politically, to try and get verifiable, objective data.
And the absolute foundation for their research was the data from the British Mandate period. They relied heavily on the Palestine Index Gazetteer. For listeners maybe not familiar, what exactly was that gazetteer and why was it so critical?
Okay, so the Gazetteer. It was produced by the Survey Directorate of the Palestine government, published back in 1945. It was this massive resource. It had over 10,000 place names, every little hamlet, every hill, every stream, and it categorized them in detail. Its real value lies in the meticulous precision of British Mandate-era surveying. It provided the definitive geographical coordinates, the grid references, the official names. That's what the researchers needed to anchor their physical search on the ground.
So they had the precise historical map, like a baseline, and then they had to cross-check that against the population data.
Exactly. They used the Gazetteer coordinates as step one. Then they checked those village locations against district lists from another key source, the Village Statistics 1945. That confirmed the population numbers and, importantly, land ownership data right before the war.
Okay.
But then, crucially, to confirm that these villages really had ceased to exist as Arab communities, they rigorously compared their findings with later official Israeli records. Things like Israeli censuses from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and government statistics. It was this layering, this cross-referencing, that gives the book its real authority.
That sounds incredibly comprehensive, but they must have needed strict criteria for including a village, right? To make sure they weren't counting, say, temporary displacements or places that were just moved nearby. How did they narrow it down to those specific 418?
They were very specific, yes. For a village to be included, it had to be a defined settlement with its own distinct name and a stable population before 1948. They deliberately excluded certain areas. Anything that fell within the boundaries of what would become the West Bank or Gaza Strip was out. The focus was depopulation within the territory that became Israel.
Right.
They also had to filter out some Bedouin settlements, particularly those that were more semi-nomadic, and places where perhaps the population had already relocated internally for other reasons before the war started. Another key filter was excluding places where a Jewish settlement, the kibbutz or moshav, already existed on part of the land. That helped really isolate the villages occupied and depopulated, specifically during the 1948 conflict and its immediate aftermath.
That filtering process alone tells you something about how complex the situation on the ground was. But the real heavy lifting, the sort of detective work, must have been the field research itself. How systematic was that?
It was meticulous. Field teams were sent out with those detailed Palestine Gazetteer maps literally in their hands. Their job was, first, confirm the exact coordinates on the ground. Then, locate any ruins. And search for other physical markers, old landmarks, cisterns, wells, anything that could help establish the historical footprint of the village.
I remember reading in the source that they noted how difficult this physical confirmation was, especially in those flat, lowland areas. It sounds like they were often looking for something that was almost designed to disappear.
It really was detective work, trying to read clues in a landscape that had been fundamentally changed. Those flat, fertile areas, particularly up in the Hula Basin and down in the Besan region, they were the toughest. Villages there, as we said, often mud brick. Easy targets for just complete agricultural leveling.
Yeah.
plowed under, turned into huge fields.
So how did they find them?
Well, the source mentions that sometimes, to try and pinpoint the exact spot of a lost village, researchers actually had to ask for help from longtime residents of nearby kibbutzim, people who had been there for decades and had actually witnessed the transformation happen.
That must have been an incredibly delicate, maybe awkward conversation, asking someone living on the new landscape to point out where the vanished community used to stand.
Absolutely. The whole research process was inherently sensitive. You're dealing with conflicting memories, contested narratives right there on the ground. And the photos, the 230 photographs that are included in the book, the visual proof of all that remains, they were chosen very carefully. They were actually categorized to show three things: sites where there were clear physical ruins left,
Okay.
sites showing houses that were just left to decay naturally over time, and perhaps most importantly, sites showing the complete lack of physical remains, using absence itself as a form of documentation.
Okay, so the methodology feels really solid. That rigor then leads us to a crucial question. What did this landscape actually look like before everything changed? We need to set the scene: Palestine around 1946.
Right. If we look at the population distribution maps by district from 1946, the demographic picture is, well, it's very clear. Across the country, the Palestinian Arab population was the majority in almost every single district we're focusing on here.
Can we get into some specifics? I think maybe some listeners picture a territory already sharply divided, but the reality on the ground was much more integrated, wasn't it? More continuous.
Precisely. Take districts like Jaffa. The population there was 71% Palestinian Arab. Haifa, even though it was a major port, a growing industrial center with significant Jewish immigration, was still 53% Palestinian Arab.
Still a majority.
Still a majority.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the central and southern districts, Nablus, Jerusalem, Hebron, the Palestinian majorities were huge, often over 90%. In Hebron's case, it was 96% Palestinian Arab. So this really establishes the pre-1948 reality. These districts had a deeply rooted majority Palestinian presence.
Which then raises the important and maybe more complicated question of land ownership around 1945. This is complex, but we need to look at those percentages. Palestinian-owned, Zionist-owned, and public or other land, district by district.
Yes, and this is where you really have to understand the intricacies of land law under the British Mandate. The data in the book, based on 1945 figures, shows some really interesting variations. For example, up in Safad district, 50% of the land was Palestinian-owned compared to 18% Zionist-owned. In Haifa, closer figures, 42% Palestinian, 36% Zionist. But then you go south again to Hebron, and land ownership was an amazing 96% Palestinian.
And we need to be clear about what ownership actually means in this context, right? The data often comes from fiscal records, tax records kept by the mandate government, and it includes huge areas of uncultivated land, especially down in the Negev desert. It's not just a simple count of who's farming which field at that moment.
No, it reflects the broader legal framework of land tenure. And the picture was made even more complex by traditional ownership systems. You see, these villages weren't just collections of private plots. Often, their land was divided into small private holdings, yes, but also large areas of communal land known as musha.
Musha, okay.
With musha, the land was periodically redivided among the village families. And then there was another crucial category, waqf.
Waqf, religious endowment.
Exactly. Land dedicated for religious or charitable purposes, supporting a mosque, a school, the poor. And waqf land often had restrictions on selling it, which further complicated land tenure.
Let's try and ground this in the character of village life itself. These 418 places weren't just points on a map. They were living, functioning socioeconomic units. What was the rhythm of life typically like?
Well, they were overwhelmingly agricultural societies, deeply tied to the land. They relied mostly on traditional farming practices, growing olives, cereals like wheat and barley, citrus fruits, cotton in some areas, plus animal husbandry, raising sheep and goats. The village itself was a distinct unit, often with its own local crafts, maybe a blacksmith, a potter, basic services.
And culturally, what defined them?
Culturally, they were often very rich. The sources make a point of emphasizing this. These villages frequently contained ancient sites, ruins, historical markers. They had mosques, sometimes churches, local shrines dedicated to saints or prophets, and significantly, they almost always had schools, institutions that anchored the community's past but also looked towards its future. So the loss of these 418 villages isn't just about empty land. It's the complete uprooting of this established social, economic, and historical fabric, replacing these distinct centers of life with, well, absence.
Right. Let's look closer now at the fate of the buildings themselves, the architecture. You mentioned that while many villages were destroyed quickly and totally, the sources also show this slower, maybe more painful process of decay after people were forced out.
Yes, that's right. The photographs really show this difference. Where houses were built of more durable stone, like in the hill country, they weren't always bulldozed right away. So you see these images of abandoned, ruined houses. Places like Khirbat el-Tanur near Jerusalem, or the remains of Kaf-Alam in the Haifa area. These houses just sort of fell apart over decades, open to the weather, once their inhabitants were gone.
And it's often the civic buildings that tell a particular story. You mentioned, ironically, that the village school was often the last structure standing.
It's a striking pattern. These schools were usually built with stronger materials, maybe stone or concrete, often a more modern design than the older village houses.
A very powerful irony, isn't it? The building meant for the future becomes the main physical link to the vanished past. Can you give some examples where the school outlasted the rest?
Sure. The school building at Kuala, in the Al-Ramla district, was noted as one of the few things left standing. Similarly, the school in Al-Khalisa up in Safad, and the deserted school of Deir al-Qasi in the Acre district. These buildings often remain visible long after the houses around them had just crumbled into rubble.
And what about religious structures, mosques, churches? Were they usually targeted for destruction or more often just left to decay?
It seems to have been mixed, but many were simply abandoned and left to fall down over time. The sources include photos of these abandoned or decaying mosques, churches, local shrines. We see the image of the church at Ikrit, which is intact but empty, a very famous case we'll touch on again. There are also examples of mosques slowly decaying, like the one in Al-Majdal, or the ruined shrine and mosque complex of Ahmad al-Fallujah near Gaza. These cultural landmarks just stand there like silent, fading witnesses to the communities that used to gather in them.
Now, let's discuss repurposing. This seems like the most, perhaps, dramatic kind of transformation, where the physical building stays, but its entire meaning, its community identity, is replaced.
Yes, the reuse of existing buildings is really illuminating. It shows the literal, physical takeover of space, domestic space, civic space. The book details specific village houses, specific buildings that were converted to serve the needs of the new inhabitants or the new state.
And the sheer variety of how they were reused is what really jumped out at me. It's not just big institutional changes, but very everyday, mundane shifts, too.
Think about these examples from the book. A solid village house in Khalid, that's in the Tulkarm area, was repurposed, actually converted into a synagogue, a complete change of religious function.
Right.
Or, more commercially, a house in Al-Qubayba, near Al-Ramla, was turned into a restaurant.
And the industrial reuse you mentioned earlier.
Yes. A village house in Yazur, near Jaffa, became an outlet for a clothing factory. And remember the school building at Beit Chiz, also near Al-Ramla. Built to teach children, it was transformed into a military fire observation post. These shifts really show how the geography of ordinary life was just functionally and symbolically absorbed into the new reality.
We should also just briefly touch on the final resting places again. What was the general condition of the village cemeteries that the researchers documented?
Generally, across the country, the village cemeteries have suffered badly from neglect and encroachment. The sources point to examples like the cemeteries in Kamaika in Acre or Quadita up in Safad. They're often overgrown, tombstones have fallen or been broken. Sometimes surrounding development, fields, or buildings literally encroaches onto the cemetery land. This decay of the cemeteries just adds another layer to that story of physical and cultural erasure.
Okay, now let's move from these broader patterns to the specifics,
Yeah.
the kind of granular detail that really gives the book its narrative force. We're going to look at specific villages in two very different areas, starting up north in the Acre district, right near the border with Lebanon.
Okay, first up we look at Al-Bassa. Now, before 1948, this was a pretty large, prosperous village. It sat on a rocky hill. Its population was recorded as 2,950 Arabs in 1944-45, so quite substantial. Economically, it was known for its olives, wheat, tobacco, and interestingly, silkworm production. And the population was mixed religiously, mostly Muslim, but it included 121 Greek Catholics and about 10 Protestants as well.
The account of its depopulation in the book is particularly detailed and, frankly, quite grim. Al-Bassa was occupied in October 1948 during something called Operation Hiram. What does the source detail about what happened to the people then?
Yes, the account is harrowing. Operation Hiram was a major Israeli military offensive late in the war, October 48, focused on the Upper Galilee. The detailed history provided in the source material describes Israeli forces entering Al-Bassa, rounding up the villagers, There are specific details given, recounting how they selected a group of young men, including, it mentions, a Catholic priest, and then executed 5 or 6 of them on the spot.
Right there in the village.
Yes. And following that, the rest of the villagers were dispersed. Some were moved internally to other villages still under Israeli control. Many others were forced out, exiled across the border into Lebanon.
And what's left of that community today, that thriving mixed village?
Well, today, an Israeli settlement called Yara stands on the village lands. It was established very quickly, also in 1948. But despite that complete transformation, the book confirms that one piece of the old village remains visible. A paved village street, just a fragment of road, serving as a sort of literal pathway back into the memory of Al-Basa.
Next, let's turn to Ikrib. This is a case that's actually received quite a lot of attention over the years, partly because of the legal battles involved.
That's right. Ikrit was situated on a steep hill close to Al-Basa, connected to it and another village, Tarbika. It was particularly notable for its large Greek Catholic community, about 400 people. Agriculturally, it focused on olives, figs, grapes, typical hill country produce.
Now, Ikrib was also captured during Operation Hiram, October 48, but its depopulation story has this unique and very bitter element, the promise of return.
Yes, that's really the core of the Ikrit tragedy. When the Israeli military occupied the villagers were explicitly told by the army officers they just needed to leave temporarily for maybe 2 weeks for military security reasons along the border, and then they could come back.
A specific promise.
A specific promise. But they were never allowed back. They were subsequently and permanently denied the right to return. And the finality of it was brutally enforced when the village itself, except for the church, was systematically dynamited and destroyed by Israeli military engineers in December 1951. This happened even while the villagers were actively pursuing legal appeals in Israeli courts to be allowed back home.
Which makes the current state of Ikrit incredibly symbolic, doesn't it? What does this site look like today?
Well, the rest of the village area is now mostly just ruins, rubble, and land used for grazing animals. But the documentation points out that only the church building itself is still standing. Preserved, yes, but hollow. A monument at the heart of a community that's vanished. It really stands as the physical symbol of that broken promise.
Moving down towards the coast now, let's look at Al-Zib, a coastal village, different kind of economy.
Yes. Al-Zib was located right on the Mediterranean shore. It had a significant Arab population, too, 1,910 people in the mid-1940s. Its economy was based on staples like olives and cereals, but also cash crops like cotton, benefiting from the coastal climate.
Al-Zib was occupied earlier, back in May 1948. This was by the Carmeli Brigade, which was part of the Haganah forces before the official Israeli army was fully formed. What happened to that large coastal community?
The sources indicate most villagers either fled north, managing to cross into Lebanon, or they were internally displaced, moved to other Arab villages that remained inside the new state's boundaries. And the way the land of Al-Zib was transformed afterwards is maybe one of the most striking examples of preservation combined with complete functional change.
How so? What happened there?
Well, the village mosque was actually restored, but explicitly for tourism purposes. And the House of the Mukhtar, the village headman, the key figure in local government that's been turned into a private museum, the area with the ruins is now used as a recreation spot, a park area. And a kibbutz, Gesher Haziv, was established on part of the village land. So it shows how historical structures can be maintained, even restored, but completely disconnected from their original community and purpose.
Okay, let's shift gears now and move south, away from the Galilee Hills and into the Beisan district. This region is geographically quite different. It's a lowland valley area, which poses its own challenges for preservation, as you mentioned.
Exactly. The Beisan area, it's geographically really important. It's in the Jordan Valley, a natural corridor linking the Galilee region with Transjordan. Before 1948, it was overwhelmingly Arab populated and characterized by very intensive farming on the fertile valley floor. And the type of construction used there, mostly mud brick, had a huge impact on what, if anything, remained.
So let's start with Al-Hamidiyya. Tell us about what it was like before 1948.
Al-Hamidiyya was located on a small hill, overlooking that rich Beisan Valley. Crucially, its houses were mostly simple structures, built from mud brick. The village economy was based on agriculture cereals, but also bananas and citrus fruits, benefiting from the valley climate.
And the depopulation. Al-Hamidiyya was occupied on May 20th, 1948 by the Golani Brigade. Given that mud brick construction, what was the physical result?
The result was total obliteration, just complete erasure. The source notes that after the residents fled or were expelled, The entire village site of Al-Hamidiya was leveled. Because the buildings weren't stone, they were just easily absorbed back into the earth. The land is now entirely cultivated by Israeli farmers. The documentation is stark. There's literally no physical evidence of the village left today. It's maybe the most extreme example of physical erasure in the book.
Just gone. Our final case study, then, is Al-Tira, sometimes known as Tirat al-Marj. What defined this village?
Al-Tira sat on the slopes of a hill overlooking a wadi, Wadi al-Bira. A really key feature for its economy and daily life was its spring, Ain al-Zawiya, that provided essential water. And it farmed a large area, growing cereals and also irrigated crops thanks to the spring water.
The history of its depopulation is noted in the sources as being a bit complex or maybe ambiguous.
Yes, the complexity seems to be around the exact timing and who gave the order. Some sources, the book site, suggest that forces associated with the Jewish National Fund actually expelled the residents quite early, maybe March 1948. This might suggest an earlier move aimed at land control.
Before the main conflict really escalated there.
Potentially. Other accounts, however, suggest the villagers were more formally ordered to leave over 1 month later by the Israeli military authorities. So this ambiguity about the timing, it kind of illustrates that the process of depopulation varied from place to place. It wasn't always a single event.
And what's left of Al-Tira today? What did the researchers find?
Today, the site still has some remains of stone houses. You can see those. There are also cypress trees, which often mark old village sites and grassy areas. The whole area is now fenced off. And subsequently, Israeli settlements, including one called Ergun Burakov, were established on the village lands, effectively layering new communities and farming onto the agricultural heritage of Al-Tira.
Okay. So we've gone through the methodology, the context, these really detailed case studies. What does it all mean when you put it together?
Well, what the source material really emphasizes, and what I think comes through clearly, is that this work is much more than just an academic list. It stresses the ongoing importance of this record. It's not just a catalog of names and dates. It's framed explicitly as a tribute to the human history, the geography, the culture of these 418 specific places.
It provides that essential historical detail, doesn't it? The specifics needed to anchor the story of the Nakba, the catastrophe, as Palestinians term it, in something tangible, something real. By putting together all this meticulous data, statistical, topographical, cultural, for every single one of these villages, the authors were trying to prevent that vacuum, the one created by physical destruction, from just being filled with silence or historical vagueness.
And the enduring legacy is, well, it's profound. The loss of these villages is clearly described as a deep wound. It represents a displacement that still affects millions of people today across the region and in the Palestinian diaspora worldwide. This book really highlights the huge challenge of keeping historical memory alive when the actual physical structures, the landscapes themselves, have been so fundamentally changed, overlaid by new towns, new farms, even theme parks.
It's such a powerful example of how history is contested, not just in books, but literally on the ground, through the earth itself. The villages might mostly be piles of rubble or fence lines or manicured parks now, but this incredibly painstaking documentation proves that a people's history, its statistics, its geography, its culture, it can survive even when the physical evidence is deliberately removed or decays. It's a way of making sure that absence itself becomes a form of evidence.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. When the physical landscape has been so radically altered, when a generation might be separated from its ancestral home only by seeing perhaps a crumbling wall or an overgrown, forgotten cemetery, what essential role does this kind of meticulously detailed documentation, the kind compiled in All That Remains, what role does it play in shaping historical and political consciousness for the long term? Especially for generations who may never actually visit the original site. How does knowing the specific location, the details of a vanished home, sustain a historical narrative, maybe even a claim across time?